Share with us your values and your value story, because conscious capitalism at the end of the day is all about what's important. And so introduce yourself to the audience through the lens of what's important, so important that would have you give up your very valuable time to be here.
Certainly. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you and with this community, especially at a time such as this. So Tulaine Montgomery, and I came here, traveled from DC, and yay, DMV. Shout out to the DMV. And in thinking about this, I am notoriously uncomfortable sharing my story, so Soyini helped me think about it in terms of values, which I appreciate, because I think about values a lot, as I know all of you do. So I reflected on the conscious capitalism community's core tenets, right? And I have them here: higher purpose, stakeholder orientation, conscious leadership, and conscious culture. And I will say that all of those tenets resonate deeply with me personally and with the work that I do at New Profit. I believe deeply that the systems that just feel like reality for us, they're made by human beings who made a set of decisions. And I'm fascinated. In another life, I aspire to be a neuroscientist, and I'm fascinated by these brains of ours and how much what we experience as reality are simply a set of choices that we've made over and over and over again. And so I believe in reinvention. That's a value of mine. I have the value of expansive community. That's a value of mine. I believe in and have the value around transformation and healing. That's a value. And I also have the value around evolution. And I do believe that we, as people, and certainly in the United States of America, are poised for an American evolution. It's time to evolve our relationships, our mental models, our structures, our processes, our protocols, and the stories we tell each other about what humans can achieve when they are in intentional community.
Yeah, definitely. So as you think about mental models and evolution as one of the things that's really important to you, I want everybody to take a deep breath. I'm going to say something that you're not going to like. You're going to not like me for this. But there's a school of, but part of what we're trying to do is challenge each other.
That's right.
There's a school of thought that says that capitalism can actually not be fixed.
Right.
That it's inherently exploitive because of the way it takes value from some and redistributes that value to others.
Right.
And typically that happens along power dimensions of who has power and dimensions of social hierarchy. And the way that I've said this to other people is that the only reason my African DNA is in Atlanta and not in Accra is because of the evils of capitalism. So what's your thought on whether or not capitalism can be fixed, which I know everybody in the room is very hopeful that it can, or whether or not, we're playing for the wrong team as such?
Yeah. Well, I love that you asked the question, because the question looms in many of our minds, and because we don't speak it and give it voice and a space to be interrogated, it actually wields power over us and limits our ability to imagine a form of capitalism that could be expansive and not extractive. So I'm really glad that you asked the question, and I'm always up for a good, kind of rigorous, kiki, as some would say. So, let's see, there's a couple of things. You talked about a brutal version of capitalism enabled people who identified as Christian and loving God to create a form of extractive labor creation that said it was tolerable in the eyes of God to treat a group of humans who were easily identifiable because of the difference in their skin color as chattel. So the transatlantic slave trade that you referenced actually birthed a particular form of slavery. Slavery is not new, but it birthed chattel slavery, which is a particularly brutal set of choices that a group of human beings made, right? So this is what I would say. Capitalism, it is a structure, but the values that undergird it are what we actually end up debating. And I feel like my friend Lynn earlier this afternoon invited us to consider that we actually do have power to shift the values that fuel capitalism. And it's interesting, right? Because we're in a room full of CEOs, investors, leaders, thought leaders, aggregators of capital, influencers of the narrative that we share. So if even the folks in this room made a decision that we were going to really redefine capitalism based on values, right? If we made that decision and then not only made the decision, because in theory all of us have, right? We showed up. But if we then did the work of aligning our structures, our processes, our networks, our incentive systems within our companies and businesses, if we did the work of aligning the values we aspire to and the businesses that we lead, the game would already be transformed. We don't actually have to wait for a huge event outside of ourselves. That this room alone, if we focus not just on the aspiration, which I believe everybody here shares, but we actually did the work of alignment, right? Mm-hmm. That's where we would see the change. And here's the thing, when you are aligning around a way of leading that's counterculture, right? And I would say that expansive, generative capitalism and leadership is still counterculture. You can't expect to get affirmed by the status quo and the systems that exist. Am I making sense? Are you with me? Yes. Okay, I'm looking around, there's some lights in my eyes. I want to make sure I see head nods, okay. So that means that communities like this one are not just nice to have, they're required. Mm-hmm. And I'm a student of history and a futurist, which means that it gets pretty interesting in this mind sometimes. But what history has shown us over and over and over again is that when people wanted to evolve or expand an existing system that seemed unchangeable, right? Think about the ending of apartheid. Think about the ending of Jim Crow legislation in the United States. Think about things that seemed unchangeable by anybody's standard that were transformed completely. It took a group of human beings who not only made a decision around their values, but did the hard, rigorous work of constantly aligning what they say they believe in with what they do. Mm-hmm. So all to say, do I believe that we're on the wrong team? I would say absolutely not, because we're on the team focused on evolution and focused on generative, expansive economies that recognize that the resources we have on the planet are precious, as are the resources of the people who we hire, employ, serve, and recruit to consume our products and services. Like, these are precious resources. They're not expendable. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's get specific.
Sure.
What are some of the, I know, right? Like, you know, we're trying to align here. We're all trying to align.
Yeah, let's do the work.
So let's talk about how does that actually happen? Yeah. What are some of those very specific decisions that you think the people in this room need to be making differently to actually shift the energy, shift the collective consciousness?
Absolutely. Well, you and I have talked about something I call strategic sacrifices. Mm-hmm. And I think strategic sacrifices are critically important for leaders. I mean, look, first of all, we are living in and leading, we're living in and leading in a time that we as a species have never experienced before. Thomas Friedman talks about the age of acceleration. That's his language for it, right? But if you look at everything from technology to the changes on the planet, to the changes in human demographics, like across just about every dimension of our shared existence, life is changing. And it is changing at a pace that we have never experienced before. Like, when you think about what it took to move from being people who traveled primarily by foot or by animal, and to now have vehicles and cars and planes. Like, we had the benefit, these brains of ours had the benefit of quite a bit of time of inventions evolving. And like, now we're in moments where, look, I started my first entrepreneurial venture and didn't use email for the first few years, didn't need it. And now, like, that email isn't even as relevant as it once was. I mean, the idea that we're living through changes that are unimaginable, some of the things I see now feel like watching an episode of The Jetsons. That's a cartoon for anyone who doesn't know. And so my point is, to your question, that I do think it's important, one, specifically, to get really honest with ourselves that we can't solve exponential problems with linear thinking. What I mean by that is, we as leaders have to get really comfortable with the complex, difficult decisions in front of us. And I think one of the things that happens is, as humans, we really crave simplicity. Yeah. We just want it to be yes or no, right? Black or white. You know, we prefer those kinds of neat, well-packaged solutions. But as CEOs and leaders and investors and philanthropists, we have to build a relationship with the complex. And so there's a specific framework that I want to offer that I think is gold to your question about tactics. How many of you, with a show of hands, have heard of the Stockdale Paradox? Okay, some hands, but not as many as I'd like. So quick, short version, because we don't have a ton of time. Stockdale, named after Admiral Stockdale. He is somebody who survived what was seen as unsurvivable, was a prisoner of war during the Vietnam conflict. I'll fast forward through all of that to say that he and a few men, and it was men in his case, made it home. And you can imagine there was this wave of curiosity, right? About like, how did you make it? Like it was designed to just take you out. How did you do it? And Admiral Stockdale talked about what was then coined as the Stockdale Paradox. And what he said is that the people who survived what seemed unimaginable or unsurvivable were the people who had a duality, two things at once. They had both an unshakable faith that they could make it home, right? So they were saying, I'm gonna make it. I'm gonna make it. I'm starving. I'm gonna make it. I've hurt myself and no one cares. I'm still gonna make it. But they also at the same time had an unblinking eye looking at the realities of their situation. And it's the combination, it's that duality of having the unshakable faith, in our case, the clear vision of impact, the clear values that drive your business, that unshakable faith combined with the unblinking eye. In the case of the Stockdale Paradox, people had to understand, well, look, we're not getting water that is safe to drink, and so here's how we can purify the water even while we hold out and keep the faith that we will make it. So in that context, it's visceral, it's violent, it's physical. But I would offer that as leaders leading during this era, that we have to negotiate the Stockdale Paradox all the time. We have to have an unshakable faith that our vision of impact, success, and values can be achieved while not telling ourselves not one single lie about the existing barriers to that. So what does that mean? Again, getting more and more specific. When we look at our hiring practices, we have to tell ourselves the truth. In this country, we live in a highly, highly segregated society. We do not typically have relationships outside of our identity group, our political affiliation, our economic class, our religious beliefs, right? That fragmentation is getting worse than ever. And yet, by the year 2040, we will live in a nation that is majority people of color. But here's the thing that's particularly interesting about that. We're not simply going to switch one dominant group for another dominant group. It's going to be a coalition of groups and identities and ethnicities that will make the majority. And so it means to me that tell ourselves the truth. If we want to continue to thrive as CEOs, if we want to have impact that's aligned with the values of conscious capitalism, we better get good about leading and sustaining coalitions across identity and difference. Because in a multiracial society, which is where we actually already are, and it's going to be accelerated at a much faster pace than most, people forecasted. People who know how to lead coalitions, and that could be your workforce in your company, that can be your community, wherever you're leading. People who can lead coalitions, people who don't require homogeneity to thrive. Those are the people who will be able to move forward, to have successful enterprises, to build communities that thrive, and to have a legacy of impact on the society that they can be proud of on the other side.
If I could whistle, I would. I'm not a good whistler. Yeah.
I can't whistle either. I wish I could.
Yeah, right? I wish I could whistle. Maybe somebody in here can whistle. Anybody can whistle?
I heard somebody whistle.
I heard somebody whistle. All right. Thank you.
That's gold right there. That's one, yeah.
So let's pull on the thread of strategic sacrifice.
Yeah, please, yeah.
Can you tell us a story about like a particularly difficult sacrifice or decision that you had to make?
Oh, there's many. I make them every day.
Right? You're CEO, right?
Every day. Yeah, that's the job. I mean, so one is, so at New Profit, we are a venture philanthropy, which means that we identify and invest in social impact leaders, people who have decided to, in some way, build opportunity, access, and resource for people or communities. We have raised and invested $350 million to date in our history. We've supported over 200 entrepreneurs and organizations, and we're growing. So my point in saying that is, we're committed to impact and opportunity for all and a thriving society. Well, I just told y'all you have to know how to lead coalitions and you can't depend on homogeneity. And I recently, well, it started actually in the beginning of 2020, before COVID hit. It was literally about 2 weeks before all of our lives changed forever. It was February of 2020, like literally 2 weeks before everything changed. New Profit hosted an event that we called the Inclusive Impact Action Summit. And it was like our first foray into being very intentional about expanding who we funded, how our sort of portfolio looked, and how it would be a better representation of the society we're in, right? So I was doing my thing, and I was actually in a room of donors and investors, and we were doing our workshop, and then somebody came to the door and they said, Tulaine, you may need to come to this room over here. And it turned out that what was happening is we had a group of about 50 entrepreneurs who we had either invested in or who we were in process with. And we told them at the beginning of the session, tell us the truth. We want to know the actual impact of the way we've engaged with you. There will be no consequence and no harm done. You won't be put on a list. You won't be viewed or named problematic. You won't lose favor with us as a funder and investor. We want you to tell us the truth. And they did. They told us the truth. And so I got pulled into the other room. They said, leave the investors for a minute. We need you to come over here. Because, you know, at the time, we were not accustomed to hearing the truth in such a direct way. Because we had, like many of us in the room, kind of subconsciously played into the power dynamics where if somebody is an employee, a potential grantee or partner, and there's a power dynamic that you just sort of like kind of judge the quality of the interaction by how good it feels. That make sense? You with me? Yeah. So it's really important. And in that case, the strategic sacrifice I made was one, having to hear and listen to things that I'd worked really hard on. Things that took a lot of energy and effort that were done with good intention. I had to listen to the fact that their impact was different than what I intended. And I had to do it and not tell myself a story while listening about what was wrong with that person or those people. And this sounds basic, but ask yourself, when somebody is telling you the truth about an impact you've had, whether it's an employee, a colleague, your middle management team, your board, and I'm
assuming you mean a negative impact, because the positive ones we like to hear.
Absolutely. Thank you for clarifying.
Right?
I'm talking about a negative impact. Though we sometimes struggle to take in the positive too, but we're going to get to that. That's another workshop. I'm talking about the negative.
Right.
And just sit and think, and I'm not going to ask you to publicly share, sit and think about a time when somebody who you wanted to be pleased with your work or who you needed to approve your request had critique for you.
And I'm going to add another dimension.
Please.
Somebody who was lower on the social hierarchy.
Yes,
Ooh.
That's right. It's very easy to make that person the problem.
Right.
And so in that instance, it changed my life because I did the work and I did my breathing and all my work to be able to just listen. And when I heard myself being like, and then, just listen, right? And we have a lot of, but you have to know yourself, right? You have to know what are the sort of on-ramps that you use to stop paying attention, you know? And so I listened, and I gotta tell you though, going through that experience, it was about probably an hour and a half of hearing about all the things that we worked hard on that didn't quite work. But it built so much credibility and trust. And what happened after that is that New Profit, we were able to transform our relationships with not only the folks we invested in, but the other social impact leaders across the country, because folks said, they're real, you can trust them. And so people came to us saying, we think that you should partner with these incredible leaders that you may not know about yet, but we do because we're actually out doing the work. And so what it did is it amplified New Profit's reach. It increased efficiency because there was a whole set of outreach that we didn't have to do. Others did it on our behalf. It built credibility in ways that enabled us to do a higher quality of service and partnership because we learned about the impact we were having that we didn't know before. It improved us across every aspect of our operational function and impact. So that was an example, but it required me sitting and listening to people telling me what I had gotten wrong. Yeah.
Wow. So, as you think about strategic sacrifice, and what are some of the sacrifices that you think a conscious capitalist can expect to make, especially for folks who may be coming into this journey, maybe for the first time? What are some trade-offs that you think people can expect to be faced with?
It's a great question.
I try.
You do.
Yeah.
Well, you do. You do.
I try.
You do. You succeed. You do.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to start with the very, very micro, and it may be unsatisfactory, and I apologize in advance if it is. But really, we have all the tools and capabilities we need to transform our organizations and our businesses. We really do. It's not beyond us. I think it really takes folks who are in leadership positions creating more and more relationships and opportunities to get told the truth. I think it's really pretty simple. And sometimes I say things that are that simple and people are like, oh, that's just not even rigorous. But you want to come up with something rigorous, try actually listening to somebody tell you what you got wrong.
Right?
Few things are actually more rigorous, right?
Especially when they're unhappy, right?
Yes.
When you've had a negative impact and they're voicing some, emotion about the impact,
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely. And I don't know about you all, but New Profit is an intergenerational workforce. And it's just really interesting to me to notice how across generations, there are different relationships with how much discomfort is tolerable, right? How much access one should have to executive leadership, and how quickly one should be recognized for one's gifts. I see a lot of heads nodding. So, I get to practice what I'm talking about all the time. But I would say that in this room, I think what you should expect, you're probably already experiencing. You should expect that that sometimes folks in your workforce, they may approach you with skepticism and distrust. They may put a burden of proof on you that is higher than you think is reasonable. That when you say you stand for a certain set of values, that you actually mean it. Yeah, I see heads nodding. You understand me? And so you should expect that you are a counterculture pioneer. You should expect that when you say, I stand for businesses and enterprises and organizations that are expansive, that are inclusive, and that are thriving and successful, you should understand that you are not yet mainstream, right? And so what I know to be true for counterculture leadership is that, I said it earlier, we can't expect to, get a lot of, atta-girls, atta-boys from mainstream systems. We got to give them to ourselves and get them from each other. We got to expect that it's like, you got the machete and you're on that terrain and you're cutting back, to clear a path. So just don't expect people to immediately say you're the best thing going because you have values that are right. Expect skepticism. Have support networks where you can, with absolute honesty and candor, talk about the impact on you, because here's the thing. Someone earlier talked about our parasympathetic nervous system. I would offer that depleted, enraged, skeptical people cannot build a new world. And so the reason I'm starting with the micro is because if we're caught up in the frenzy of how hard it is, and if we're surprised when people are skeptical that we as executive leaders actually do want to build a system that serves not only us and our shareholders and stakeholders, but also them. We can't afford to waste a lot of time being surprised or hurt by that, because that's kind of how things were set up. And we're doing something counterculture. So I think the importance of this community, I know I'm saying that over and over again, but it's because having a space where you can tell the truth about what it took to move from A to B, building new incentive systems, building hiring practices where you were able to recognize expertise that might look different than what your team was accustomed to. There's a whole set of learning that you have to do. But the last thing I'll offer on this question is, we're all aspiring to do something that none of us have ever actually experienced. We're aspiring to build an equitable, inclusive, thriving, just economy and society. None of us have actually lived in that. So I think that it takes incredible humility and vision on all of our parts. Like, we really have to hold a powerful, compelling vision, and we have to, while doing that, have deep humility. That's tricky, because a lot of times when, we're visionaries, you're like, yes, I have a vision. It's, I get it. I feel that way sometimes. It's very, seductive. And I'm not saying we shouldn't. We should have that, swagger. But it has to be accompanied with deep humility, so that when we try something and it doesn't land the way we want, okay, shake it off. Talk to someone we trust. Breathe deeply. Yell and cry privately if we need to. Don't have a public breakdown just because, we got to keep moving forward, right? And I'm not being funny. I've seen some folks take some liberties with how public they are about what's hard for them, and it actually undermines the power of their leadership. So I don't say that in jest. And then we keep moving. That takes so much humility. You can see the future, but you got to make sure that people are with you. So that's what I would offer. I know it's not like do A, B, and then you get C, but I find that the work is so micro and internal for folks in this room where you already are the leaders. So it's really about how do you get the leadership vision that you have to make its way into the minds and hearts of your team, your investors, your partners.
So what about this experience gives you the most hope and joy? Because you're right, we're on completely uncharted ground in terms of human consciousness.
Yeah.
And it's hard.
It is.
So what do you think, what gives you hope that we can actually do it?
Yeah.
The Stockdale Paradox, unwavering faith that we're gonna make it.
Yeah, totally. Another great question. I have the kind of hope, there's a quote that I'm going to paraphrase that says, people talk about hope as if it's made of like whispers. But hope is gritty. Hope is tough. Hope just got up and stood up and spat out a tooth and wiped the dirt off her knuckles before she goes another round. That's the kind of hope that I have.
Right.
That's the kind of hope I have. So I think that helps to have hope that is that gritty. I don't require ease or perfection or delight even all the time to still have hope, and I think that matters. I think also that it just never fails. You go into spaces and you just meet human beings who are trying to figure out the same things. Like you and I have met. We're trying to figure out the same things.
We are.
Right? We really are. I just came, this is my first time ever being at this forum. And I've come into a room of people who, even if we look different, have different tactics, are in different specific industries, we are essentially trying to figure out the same set of things. So that gives me so much energy because I'm not alone. And our Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, released an advisory about the public health crisis around the epidemic of loneliness. Are folks familiar with that? Yeah. And he calls us to create workplaces and schools and networks that combat the devastating loneliness and isolation that people are reporting across the United States. And it is not just about feeling low, though it is that. It is also about not being able to be physically healthy or create solutions or connect with other people. So all that to say, the fact that an alternative to that loneliness is so readily available is so exciting to me. Like if I sort of tune into it, I could get, emotional about how generous and abundant it is. And all it takes is a willingness to tune into it, like to notice like the brilliance of you and the alignment. Like you and I haven't known each other long, but I already know that much, right? And that is true across this room, and it's not only true for me. So I think gritty hope, because gritty hope does not require polish or perfection to be strong and present, combined with a willingness to really tune into just how abundant the connections and alignment are. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Tulaine.
Thank you.